Welcome to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds. Hello, I'm Paul Obitelli and welcome to another edition of THA Talks, the alternative podcast show from the UK. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion, and much more. If you'd like to check out our full archive, just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. And if there's anyone who'd like to contact us and give us some feedback, maybe you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, email us info@thatalks.com, or you can go to our website and contact us via the tab there. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the show via our RSS feed, and you can also find us on iTunes and Stitcher and many other podcast directories out there. Well, hello ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in again here onto THA Talks, and thanks for the feedback I received for the last edition we did with Ben Emlyn Jones, with John Love here with me. And it was an interesting subject, and I think those subjects, although I made it no secret here on the show, I like to address very important political, spiritual subjects, which I think is very interesting and very important to get out there. Sometimes we've got to remember just to ask some questions. You know, some things you can't prove, and people think, you know, this is just mumbo jumbo, we've got to move on. But there's a lot of unanswered questions there, a lot of mysteries in this world as well. And while there's a lot of cowboys earning a living out of it and a lot of mumbo jumbo, there's a lot of it that isn't mumbo jumbo. And you've got to remember sometimes to stop and ask these questions and other fish about. I think it's healthy to open your mind like that. As the saying goes, not so much that your brain falls out, which happens with a lot of people, and then they just get lost and it all gets a bit messy. I know people like that, definitely. But you've got to open your mind and ask questions, and I guess it sort of refreshes the palate, so to speak, because the stuff that you feel strongly about isn't going to go anywhere quickly, that's for sure. So I think we can rest assured that's the case. But today we'll be speaking with David Shayler. Now, I've been wanting to get David on the show for a long time. A fascinating character, ex-Mi5 officer, has written a lot on conspiracies within the secret services and what they get up to, things that we don't know about, and also about law. Again, things about law that we don't know about, and general conspiracy stuff. He's had a lot of controversial moments through his career, but fascinating to listen to speak. I saw him in a seminar, speak at a seminar, and you really can sit and listen to him for a long time because he's got so much experience in this stuff and is so very well researched about it all. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this, and I know I will. But before we go there, we're going to go a bit further down south here in England, and we're going to bring on Mr. John White. How are you doing, John?
Hello, Paul. Oh, I'm excited. I want to see what Mr. Shayler has to say.
Yes, we've been wanting to get this show for a while, haven't we? So it's nice to have it at long last. I mean, he's obviously a busy guy, but he's a fascinating guy, and I think it's going to be one of the ones that there's so much subjects that David Shayler goes into. You know, it's going to be maybe a bit of juggling going on here because he does cover a lot of ground, doesn't he?
I'm expecting to have quite a packed hour. Yeah, it's going to be good.
Great. Well, I think we should just crack on. David Shayler, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hi, mate. Very well. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, and I'm really delighted to have you on the show. You're someone we've wanted to get on for a while. You cover some fascinating subjects, and you've got so much experience in certain fields. I understand your latest bit of work is a book that's I've seen for sale on Amazon, the organisation part of the Book of the Law. Is that your latest works? And tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it is my latest work, but there's almost an epic story behind this whole novel, basically. When I left university, I said to myself, one thing I do in life is at some point write a novel. And rather bizarrely, when I joined the Sunday Times, I met someone from Oxford who had a novel published at the age of 21 and lived to regret it because he was too young to write the novel. So when I got to about the age of 29, and I was still working for MI5, I decided to write this novel. And obviously, it's set in the world of intelligence. The lead character is obviously based on my experiences, but as a different character from me. And I spent 2 years struggling to write 60,000 words. I was actually coming home from work after having written all day on a screen, then come home to a screen and try and write this novel, because I was so determined to do it and use it as a way to try and get out of the 40-hour week, get out of Babylon. But anyway, obviously, the events overtook me, and at the time I was writing it, I was briefed in MI5 about the Gaddafi plot. I took over an operation in which they'd been investigating Guardian journalists on no basis. I also had to eject a Libyan intelligence officer, terrorist, who set up a terrorist network, because MI5 had let him in. So all these crazy things were happening while I was writing this book, and obviously that then culminated in the MI6 funding of Al-Qaeda operation against Gaddafi actually happening in about March 1996. And obviously that went wrong. Gaddafi was not assassinated, and some people died. So this was the background of me writing this book. And then obviously when I blew the whistle, I don't know if people know this, but this was August 1997. That's now almost 20 years ago. This is just absolutely incredible. It really is. But, after a week of blowing the whistle, we were in the headlines, and we've been competing that week with Princess Diana. And then obviously that's the night when we think we're going to be headline news across the world, because they've banned me trying to speak out about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. That's when Princess Diana dies in Paris in a very suspicious car accident, basically. Not a car accident, it was an obvious conspiracy to kill. So after that, when we hid away in the middle of nowhere in France, I then wrote another 160,000 words of this novel, and then basically had to cut it back down. But I had the basic novel there by the time I went to prison on the 1st of August 1998, when they arrested me up to Paris. I've edited it a couple of times since then. It has been up online, but it's part of my wider issue. The novel I wrote from the point of view of an atheist, and I tried to take the word Christ out of the novel. So even, for example, Christ Church College becomes Ex-Church College. And I did this because I was an atheist. I was trying to write a novel about the meaninglessness of life. And I realised when I came to read the novel as a spiritual being, that actually I'd written a novel about spiritual redemption. And that really is the way of creation, basically, that the will of one man will not outwit the will of God, basically.
Right.
So this novel, it's a funny novel from that point of view, but just to be clear, it is actually takes place in the genre of a thriller. What I thought I wanted to do was write a book that was a hymn, really, to the English language and to English literature itself, because our literature is so rich, and obviously the thriller format was the format that dominated the 20th century. This book was written at the end of the 20th century, so it's a thriller. It uses the conventions of the spy thriller, the page, to turn the page, the red herrings, the twists in the plot, and all this kind of thing. But it uses that to then make some very pertinent points about life in mid-90s London, basically, and how the world was changing then. So in many ways, it prophesies the world that comes now, the sort of rise of this sort of wet liberalism and things like that are actually part of this book. So in some ways, it is quite prophetic, basically. And it talks at one point, I say it was written in 1990, it talks about one point, it says when you get past the millennium, every crazy lunatic terrorist is going to be letting off every bomb and all this kind of thing. So it almost, in a sense, predicts 9/11 and the war on terror and things like that.
I mean, I'm looking at the cover of the book now, and it looks very interesting. And one thing that strikes me is you've got the communist sign there, the communist flag. How relevant is that? And particularly to today, do you think it's quite relevant to what's going on politically today around the world?
I do, actually. I'm now coming to the conclusion that communism was not defeated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the people behind communism merely regrouped, basically. And in some ways seem to focus their attention upon big right-wing corporations and so on, basically. The corporatism of communism seems to be very easily adaptable to the corporatism of the current right, basically.
Right.
And it seems that they then focused on, central banks and so on. So, I mean, one way or the other, we now have more interference in our lives in the West than we've ever had in our history. The tradition of the West, of course, has been that we've had rights over government, unlike the East. And we have to state that very clearly, that the difference in Western culture and Eastern culture is that in the West, you did have these rights over government that came from that tradition of common law. whereas you didn't have that in the East. You've never had that in China. You've never had that in Russia, basically. So it's a fundamental difference.
So you think basically fundamentally the laws in the West are, we're pretty lucky to have them basically, and what's something we need to hold on to? Is that a way of looking at it?
Yeah, it's the philosophy behind those laws I'm talking about, and this again comes back to bridging it with the spiritual. It's basically love your neighbours, you love yourself. If you can't stomach that, do as you'll be done by, basically. Now, this obviously is the credo of any rational human being over the ages. I think that even any reason or compassion is going to come to a conclusion that must be paramount, because there's no situation that can be made better by not loving. It's the anger, the hatred, the fear. Those are the things that manifest as violence and war and so on, and the hatred of your fellow man. So if you can rise above that and love, that's great for you. Look at yourself first, love yourself, but also then extending that love to your fellow man, and not obviously therefore carrying out wars. Why would you want to go and drop bombs on people on the other side of the world who've done nothing to you? Of course you wouldn't do that. Obviously if you're attacked, you can defend yourself. And so then if we apply the law, of course, people that we've seen demonised in the British Zionist media, people like the IRA, we realise we're a genuine resistance movement, that the Catholics in Northern Ireland were denied rights, and people then came to arm themselves to defend themselves. And, you know, look at the history of Northern Ireland in the late 60s. That was the act of any courageous man to take up arms and defend his community, because the police wouldn't do it, and the army, although they were going to protect the Catholics, had then started persecuting the Catholics as well. So, and again, same with people like Colonel Gaddafi. He was backing Abu Nidal, who were opposed to the occupation of Palestine by Israel. So under the law, you're entitled, say, to defend yourself, to take other people to defend yourselves against an occupying force. So that's why we have the problems in the world at the moment. We haven't applied that simple principle. The wars of the last 15 years have all been unlawful. But the actions of virtually every government in my lifetime in this country has committed war crimes. Whether it was Margaret Thatcher, even if you give the benefit of the doubt on the Belgrano, which at the time people said was sailing away and therefore shouldn't have been shot at, in the Falklands War in '83. We've got the bombing of Libya in '86 when she assisted the US and allowed their planes to take off from Britain so they could bomb Tripoli. That killed civilians in Tripoli inevitably. It didn't kill Gaddafi, but that was an obvious war crime, and yet the world didn't do anything about it. If we come down on these things, then perhaps we wouldn't be in the problems that are in the world now. It's because people haven't brought these world leaders to justice for their crimes. So Thatcher got away with it. So when their next place man was brought in, which was Tony Blair, he got away with even more. Right. And we're still with the consequences of that man's enormous ego, psychopathy. I don't know what you can call it, really. I mean, even after he was fingered in the Chilcot report, he still went on this, just totally vain defence of himself that seemed to show no remorse for what he'd done to innocent people in the Middle East, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, what's your take? I mean, obviously you've had so much experience in the secret services, and from that perspective, I mean, what's your general take of what's going? I mean, this year we've had 3 or 4 terrorist attacks. We've had so much horrific events that have taken place this year. So much media, and obviously the political spectrum has just exploded and is getting very intense. What's your general take of 2017 in the UK so far?
Well, it's always been the way in the prophecy. I always said that 2016, 2017 would see some absolutely remarkable changes that people couldn't foresee. I've been saying that for a long time now, because it's predicted in the Bible. In the Bible, it's encoded in Leviticus, but it's encoded as the Hebrew year 5777, which is the equivalent of our year 2000, about October 2016 to about September 2017, basically. So this is on the cards in terms of the wider issue of where we're going with humanity. It's manifesting in terms of the political. And what is mainly manifesting through all of these things is a distrust of the political class. What people like me have known, because I believe this 20 years ago, that the government essentially are crooks, and they're in the banks, and essentially to rip us off, to take away the value of our labour in the marketplace through tricks like usury and taxation and so on, to make us then dependent on them. when actually, if we weren't giving them all that money in the first place, we could quite easily look after them. And that's, again, part of this wider issue. They're trying to essentially enslave and subjugate mankind, and obviously at the same time spiritual awakening is going on. That leads to very interesting things. I mean, I think, it's very hard to tell what's happening with terrorism these days because there's so much fakery going on. There's so little attempt to penetrate that in any way in the mainstream media that you're really stabbing in the dark. But I think one thing that is manifesting is that in some cases this genuinely is people who are almost, it's a spiritual thing. It's almost like they're in this world and things start happening where they start to awaken, but because they have no knowledge of how to cope with the spiritual awakening, they just, for want of a better term, get taken by the dark side and go and do something stupid by themselves. So this is not something that's part of a conspiracy. It's not a Manchurian candidate. There genuinely are people out there who, for want of a better term, are being called and getting it wrong, and that manifesting as violence, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of relate to it. I've seen it happen before with people. It's almost like we're at a stage now where people, it's you have to believe in something. So much is going on that people are being forced to kind of have a certain opinion and view of what's going on. But most people don't really want to see what's going on. So it's almost like just taking on board another. Almost like just shutting off from certain truths, and a lot of people are falling out now. You're getting a lot of friends that are falling out, groups that are falling out because not everyone's prepared to look at what's going on, or if they do, they're too dogmatic about their own opinions about what's going on. You know what I mean? So I definitely feel that I think there's a spiritual an awareness that's going down, that the veils are coming down. And it's very interesting because, of course, we're living in the supposed era of the apocalypse, which does mean unveiling, doesn't it? It means things, the curtains are dropping down, we're seeing things. So I think that point is particularly interesting. Yeah, definitely.
It's almost as if kind of humanity is going through the experiences I've gone through over the last 20 years, where I've had exactly that on several occasions, where I've had to tell the truth, and suddenly you find people turning on you. I have to say it's gone on and on with everything, basically. And I've got, I don't know where you are on the flat Earth, but I've had a look at it, and there's some big problems to the other side. Shall we put it that way, basically? I know people want to debate this now, but that to me is just an extension of everything else about what they lied about. Essentially, there's simply some very good scientific experiments indicating that the Earth is still. The Mitchell-Morley experiment firing photons where there's no photon displacement, showing the Earth is still. That is quantum mechanics. There's also the latest information in quantum mechanics from the latest Planck data, which shows that the Earth is the centre of the universe and that the universe is flat, basically. And then there's other traditional experiments to try and detect the curvature of the Earth, and it doesn't really seem to be there, basically.
Okay, so you stand with the whole flat Earth thing. I mean, that's interesting. We've had this subject on the show before, particularly Shana. She's covered it, and it is very interesting because it's kind of very popular for a start, and also it does have some interesting stuff out there. I mean, are you into the general gist of what's out there, or do you have your own take on what this stuff really is?
Again, it's obviously hard to come to very firm conclusions, but in the absence of being able to detect the curvature of the Earth, and that all the science seems to indicate the opposite, that the Earth is in fact flat, you'd have to say we're on some sort of flat disk. It does seem most likely we are enclosed by a dome and a firmament. Basically, there's two levels of enclosure above us. Those are the conclusions I come to. I partly base that on the Bible. Now, obviously, people will tell you all sorts of things about the Bible, but the Bible can illuminate at the right times. It's an ancient spiritual text told to us through prophets, people chosen by God to speak to mankind, and the Bible has certainly guided me on my journey because I understand how to use it. People who don't understand the Bible will never get anywhere with it, basically.
Well, I think what you're saying here is really interesting, David. Could we maybe go into that a little bit? Thinking about flat Earth, what you've referenced there is certainly interesting about quantum experiments and their conclusions suggesting that things are not what we theorise that they are. But at the same time, if we if we say, well, there's something's wrong with our model of a universe, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Earth is a flat disk. What I have the biggest problem with the flat Earth theory is how it deals with the question of Antarctica. Now, I don't know quite which model you're looking at, but the one which is very popular across the internet, the Debay Model, it says that Antarctica doesn't exist, and that it's a wall of, and what we see as Antarctica on the pictures isn't really a coastline. It's the edge of a wall of ice that surrounds the Earth, because the flat Earth model that he's developed has a North Pole but no South Pole.
Well, yeah, it's all South Pole, isn't it? It's north in the centre of all South Pole. But I don't really subscribe to the ice wall theory as such. I think it's much more likely that Antarctica is some kind of misplaced continent that was previously in massive space where there is now the Pacific Ocean, basically. We do know that...
Well, everything's moved around, hasn't it? That's the Pangea theory, and the movement of continents over vast periods of time. Well, I mean...
much bigger than we think it is as well. That's the other thing. We don't really have any data on this, other than it's much more likely flat than it's a sphere. That's what the science seems to show, including with things as basic as an atmosphere. I mean, science tells you that space is a vacuum, and any physicist should therefore tell you the atmosphere will be instantly sucked out into that vacuum. So the science of global Earth just doesn't stand up to any kind of scientific scrutiny, I reckon.
Well, as a spiritual belief, flat Earth is extremely widespread, isn't it? And not only that, but I think it's entirely fair to say that for the vast majority of human existence, flat Earth has been the dominant worldview model. And we're only looking at 500 years ago that people started to see the world in any sort of different terms. And of course, we all know that the early advocates of globe Earth were persecuted and killed for it. So we know that there was a big social struggle 500 years ago that changed the view of the world, and that was part of a process that didn't really complete until Darwinism in the mid 19th century, of slowly moving towards a material worldview to supplant the supernatural worldview of organised religion, and the shifting in dominance of power between the religious institutions and the state institutions through that period of history. So in the one sense, I'm wary of flat Earth, because I wonder, whose interests would it be in to have the dominant human view of the world return to effectively a dark age vision. I'm not entirely sure about the Islamist jihadists of ISIS, but certainly in terms of fundamentalist Islam, we've got flat Earth, fundamentalist Hinduism, flat Earth, and of course it was the dominant worldview in Christianity. So it's a paradox there, which makes me feel very wary. But I wonder, is it a big revelation or is it a step backwards? And I do wonder if really it's a spiritual challenge, because we are talking about quantum physics, as you were when you introduced the talking point, and in our quantum understanding, we know that we live in a multi-dimensional universe. Now, in other dimensions, which may be close to and accessible from this one, especially psychically, the Earth may be a flat disk, and it may and still be a globe in this dimension. And I wonder if the fact that we're dealing with the brain, the human brain, as an instrument to decode and recode reality, and the conflict between inputs in switching it to see flat and globe, and this area of confusion arises, which ultimately leads to people polarizing and both sides accusing the other of being idiot shills, which of course happens every time there's a flat Earth discussion on the internet. Somebody gets into a polarized position about it and ends up calling the other person stupid, which I certainly don't think is the right approach.
Yeah, no, obviously not. No, I like to obviously keep my head on my shoulders these things and try to arrive at my conclusions as rationally as I can. I then can argue them passionately, basically. But people are convinced by the flat Earth because of the science. But once you convince yourself of the science for the flat Earth, that is part of the wider spiritual awakening, I think. Because what we've got to understand is just how much we have been lied to, just how much. And so the more I look at all of this, the more you realise we have been fed tales. about just about everything, basically. It is frightening to come to that conclusion. I mean, I've obviously had to go through a process of cognitive dissonance several times on this journey, beginning with when I was briefed by MI6 with a plot that they said they're going to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi, where up until that point in the service, I didn't see anything to indicate that the service had assassinated people, and suddenly that became very real. And then obviously I had to evaluate what I was doing in the services. But obviously the same thing happened with 9/11, the same thing happened spiritually.
Well, the story...
That's not about now. It's a spiritual battle now. And this is what I say about the final battle is within, basically. What we're seeing is the collapse of corporatism. And obviously the biggest corporations are the banks and the governments of the world, basically. These are the two pillars who've essentially conspired against us to take the land off us, to allow us to freely enjoy our labour through, for example, house prices and so on. We've not seen a real rise in living standards since America came off the international gold standard in 1971, basically. And at the same time as that, of course, we saw the legalisation of drugs, which has only made drugs much more popular, but of course has been a massive income for organised criminal networks and the New World Order, basically. You know, you've got to join the dots in terms of how they're funded.
Oh, absolutely, David. And the child trafficking rings. Let's not forget that horror as well.
The whole thing, I say you've got to join the dots, realise the enormity of this conspiracy, what they've got away with. But how they've done that, I say, essentially through what is the puppet show of the mainstream media. Now, obviously, what we can take heart from is more and more people are obviously seeing through that. That's the manifestation we've seen through Trump and Corbyn and Brexit and everything else. The Liberals don't get this, but the commonality, of course, is a rejection of traditional politics, traditional mainstream, much more for people who look like they're speaking from the heart and have some genuine charisma about them, rather than being this kind of robotic, almost psychopathic political class that are always so desperate to offer their help, but it's always in the wrong situations, and therefore they don't help people, they make the situation
well, actually, David, I can give you some good news there. You mentioned about the Liberals not accepting that the Russia narrative is false, and that CNN and MSNBC have been dishing out fake news like fun. But that's not entirely true. There is a genuine progressive movement, or at least that's how they would describe themselves, and they're being led by people like Caitlin Johnston and also Jimmy Dore and other people on the Bernie Sanders side of American politics, who are equally as sickened by the behaviour of the mainstream media of pushing a narrative that really cannot possibly be true, and not only that, but is fundamentally dangerous to world peace, instead of doing the job they want the media to do, which is, of course, hold the Trump administration to account. And I mean, there have been well over 100 signing orders that Trump has done since he took office in January, all of which have gone completely unscrutinised inside the US media. So there is a fight back on both sides, and I think there is an alliance on both sides forming on the basis of we need a credible media that we all have confidence in. So towards a restoration of the media, I mean, it's definitely coming.
Yeah, no, I think that, again, what we've got to do is create our own media. That's what we've got to do. I much trust anybody who individually blogs, tweets for themselves, and I trust anything coming out of a corporation, basically. Even alternative sites can very easily be taken over. I have an example of this when I was working for Neon Nettle, which began as a very good site doing alternative news and spiritual stuff, but in music and things like that as well. And then we wrote an article about Zionism, which people can read for themselves. It's on if you put Shayler Scribd into the internet, you'll find my Scribd site. It's up there. It's called Condemn Zionism or Be Complicit in World War III. And I've written a lot for this site and got no reaction. And then I write one article, take about 40 minutes to get back. I get a phone call from one of the owners of the site saying, Dave, you've written an anti-Semitic article, but you haven't read it, have you? It deals with that. So he then goes off and reads it, gets back to me about an hour later. He said, I've read it 3 times, it's brilliant, I'm going to dig on it. Next night, the other co-owner of the website is stopped by the police in suspicious circumstances and arrested for not giving a breath specimen, even though he hadn't been drinking, basically.
That classic low-level bullying intimidation for
well, they took the whole website apart. Neon Nettle is now a clickbait site, basically.
It is,
so
yeah.
I would say as well, my stuff is up there, but it was written before it was a clickbait site. So that's why my stuff is there. But obviously, again, they've done that to try and discredit me as well. This is what happens. I mean, on Neon Nettle, once they've done that Zionism article, they were just overrun with all sorts of shit from Google. They got knocked down the Google rankings. They were accused of all sorts of stuff. And this is to say, this is a tactic of what we know up against. These people are evil psychopaths. I mean, when I first blew the whistle, I thought I was taking an MI5 from the British government. When I suddenly realised a few years later that I was taking an international conspiracy of psychopaths who I now correctly realise were trying to kill me and had killed me on a number of occasions, and I was an atheist. That was about the most frightening thing you could possibly imagine. In fact, that in itself was a fulfilment of the novel, because that's how I wrote the novel as a piece of fiction. I thought I could laugh at that if what would you like to be an atheist and be on the wrong side of a secret organisation that wants to kill you, how terrible would that be? And that happened to me in real life. So thank God I've become spiritual, because that's the only way you can cope with this when they come at you. You've just got to have that faith that essentially a higher power is on your side, and you enjoy some kind of protection. And you know that when you tell those difficult truths, that goes a long way in terms of karma and justice.
Well, I mean, that's what I take from your story, really, David, of your progression from your days in MI5 to realising you needed to change your life, to how your life changed, to the stages of understanding that you were describing as you were continuing to try to write your book while living in France and so forth, and then as your story has developed since. It's obviously a story of awakening and redemption. And I mean, in talking about there being a prophetic element to the book that you were writing in the late 90s, it reminds me intimately of David Icke and the Truth Vibration and his story of how he was led to knowledge. In terms of how Icke described it, it's like a deeper self was in control, and his conscious mind was just along for the ride and trying to make sense of it. And I suspect that, like me, I know I have a strong feeling that you relate to that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, from the word go spiritually, as soon as I prepared to open my eyes, I was guided. I can see how I was guided. And I was, at the time I was looking at the esoteric and becoming familiar with that, I'd get little messages to go to a certain bookshop, and when I walked in, there were two books opposite me on a shelf, both on top of the shelf, not the other books. I went over, flicked through them, realised that those were two books I had to read at that moment. So yeah, being guided, obviously, once I was open, and then of course being challenged. I mean, in 2006 when Israel was bombing, I can't remember, was it Palestine or Lebanon? I can't remember. It was Lebanon. Yeah. I just couldn't believe how Zionist the coverage was in the mainstream media, knowing how terrible Israel was and everything else. So I went on to the James Whale show, a popular radio show, and made it obviously clear I wasn't talking about Judaism, I was talking about Zionism, but nevertheless denounced Zionism and Israel, basically. And obviously that's why they then came at me in the 9/11 Truth movement and then stopped us.
It is one of those words, unfortunately, isn't it? That the social engineers have been programming the minds of a global populace since the end of World War II about that word, about that phrase, and intimidating people out of using it, basically. So in the one sense, it's courageous to use it and say, no, I'm going to speak the name of this. But on the other, I mean, especially now with Facebook and Twitter and how they censor things, perhaps it's better to talk about it in a different way now. I mean, I tend not to use the word Zionist because I can't be bothered getting 30-day bans.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but at the same time, this is why I wrote that article. And since I have gone full belt on Zionism, a lot more people know about it, basically, and I'm very glad about that. Yeah. And it's now a new area of genuine protest. The people on the side of Palestine opposed to Zionism are where genuine people with heart are going to protest. We know so much of protest, obviously, is faked and manufactured. That's one that's anti-Zionist, therefore it's not being manufactured by them, and therefore the genuine people with good hearts are on the side of the Palestinians. And I say, let's just keep denouncing Zionism because it's evil, And if people had denounced Nazism enough in the 1930s, perhaps we would have been in a better position to deal with the Nazi regime, rather than what happened in this country, in which the aristocracy and so on were secret Nazi sympathisers and would have been very happy to come to an arrangement with Hitler. no, let's denounce this. Let's not be part of what goes on in Israel and so on. Let's boycott Israel. And boycott the bloody states as well.
And of course, George Galloway also got into very hot trouble on that precise point, didn't he? The connection between Hitler and the Zionists.
Well, yeah, no, it's all very, very well documented. Ken Livingstone.
Oh, it's history. Yes, it is.
It's been very well documented. This is history, basically, and anybody who understands the world will understand that was a perfectly normal thing to do, at the time. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we now have these kind of social justice warriors who just don't seem to be able to take any truth that in any way undermines their completely rose-tinted worldview, basically.
David, what do you what's your view on the Islamic? I mean, obviously there's a lot of normal, decent Muslims living all over the world and stuff, but there is a growing concern around Europe and the West that there is Islamic growth in those parts of the world. What's your view of that? Do you think it's a big danger there that we could become an Islamic state, an Islamic country all around Europe?
Well, that's been the plan. They're using essentially again a Zionist form of Islam. This is most manifesting through Wahhabi Islam, which again, if you do the research on this, is basically created by the Zionists not that long ago, about less than 100 years ago, I think. So this is not traditional Islam, obviously. There are some lines in the Quran, obviously, which are very suspect. And this is what it has in common with Zionist Judaism, is that a Muslim is entitled to deny rights to a non-Muslim in the same way that a Zionist Jew is entitled to deny rights to a non-Zionist Jew. Not a real Jew, of course, because a real Jew lives under the two covenants of the Torah, the first 5 books of our Old Testament, which have the lines, love your neighbour as you love yourself, and then love God with all your heart, mind and soul. So a true Jew following that covenant, I'm a Jew, basically, by that covenant, a true Jew. Zionists, of course, have used every line they can in the Torah or the Tanakh to try and justify all their violence and so on, but what we read in the light of that commandment of love, basically. But to come back to Islam, this has obviously been a long plan by the Zionist New World Order to use Islamic terrorism to essentially eradicate the law in the West. This is what's been their main problem. They're actually focusing the depopulation agenda on the West. This is where the West has gone a bit soft, is they've kind of assumed if a depopulation agenda went on, I'm done out in the third world, all those people out there, don't have to worry about it. But it's the other way around. We're the ones with the tradition of rights over government. From the point of view of the Zionist New World Order, we are the biggest pain in the arse with that tradition. And therefore, they're trying to kill us off. So it's not, I'm saying it's a white genocide. It's not. It's anybody who believes in this true law, I say this true common law, and that free way to, essentially save our country, but also our own way to our own personal salvation, basically.
Yeah. Well,
my work in the law begins with the line, what is the difference between unlawful and illegal?
Yeah.
Which is something that puzzled me for many years. And the answer to that question is, in fact, the salvation of man. Because if we continue down this so-called legal route, in which everything is a legal fiction, so they can make it up as they go along, when you go to court, it's essentially a pantomime, basically. But you think it's real, like I did, because I wasn't told, and you go to prison and so on, but they say you've consented to that.
Yeah,
don't get the legal system at all. You are primarily a man, basically, a creation of God with the inalienable rights given to you by God's law. There's been a tradition in this country encapsulated by us government, also by a holy book called the King James Bible that contains that lie. It's part of our traditions. Don't let anybody tell you it's not. And with these culturists, the culture is not allowed to speak, basically. The native culture of this country, which is taking in immigrants from all over the world, from many occasions, and has subsumed culture and has withstood invasions, because everybody who's come here has had to ultimately accept it's all about the common law. Even the foreign kings like the Normans and so on, when they've come here, the Germans, they've sworn that oath, which is an oath to the law, an oath to the profession of the Gospels, which is all about, obviously, the coming of the Christ, but also the statement of the true law, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the frustrating thing at the moment, there seems to be a lack of balance in terms of people. We're so liberal at the moment that obviously we've got to respect people power, whether you're Muslim, whether you're not Muslim, whether you're Jewish, or whatever you are. If you're part of the general public, we've all got to get on, be diplomatic, and be wise to what the elite are doing. And I kind of get that. I get that liberal perspective that a lot of youngsters have out there and people have out there. But there just seems to be a lacking of defending what it is we are as Western people. And like you've been talking about, the laws that we've built our societies on and everything, it just seems to be everyone's just blind to the fact that that needs defending. And sometimes you've got to pull your sleeves up and get a bit mean and say, here's the line, this is who we are. And we've got to put ourselves first sometimes and say, this is what we're making most important. And that's what I think struggling at the moment, the lack of balance there,
If I could also, just pop in, sorry. I was also...
Go on, John.
I'd just like to say that the issue with the law is also intimate, isn't it? It is a question of the future of Islam in the West, because we have the mounting conflict between the tendency to favour Sharia law amongst European Muslims and the secular Western democratic legal system, which, yes, I mean, in a sense, it's been taking man away from the true law, because it's taken the man out of the law and imposed the statute, the false identity, the legal fiction, to replace the man, and then punish the legal fiction and put the poor man in prison who doesn't know what's going on. I mean, that's basically how common law has been usurped in Britain. But also in terms of Europe, I think when you were talking earlier about law in the West, you were a little bit generous, really, David, because common law isn't a European thing; it's an English and British thing. We've kept that heart of true justice alive to see whatever the written law happens to be. If you put 12 people in a room and they hear both sides of the story and they decide that the guy in the dock is innocent, that's it. He's innocent. And if any statute law by Parliament is found to contravene the natural common law, the statute law is voided there and then and is not law. And we've had that happen in English courts time and time again over the centuries. So this spiritual quality to law, it exists in English law still, although it's been much eroded and hidden. But now we have that law, and we have the secular democratic law, and the human rights is established by the UN, and the equality is established by the UN. And into that we have another form of common law in effect, the Sharia law. But unlike the judgment of 12 ordinary people, the Sharia law is dominated by what the book says. And when you get into a situation where you face the judgment of your peers, the problem is when your peers are a bunch of judgmental arseholes, and then you get great injustice, which is why women are suffering under Sharia law or wherever it's implemented in the world. I'm sorry, I just thought I'd raise those points to see if David could feed back to them.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Hadith, rather than the Quran, does not contain the line, love your neighbour as you love yourself, which is obviously in the Old and New Testaments. But it does have it in the Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad based upon the Quran and so on. But there are, obviously, that is the problem, is that they're now pushing Sharia law again as another way of removing this true law. And this is not common law, this is true law. It must be distinguished from the common law, small c, small l, which was famously created by medieval judges. It's not the same law as that. They're very clever, these people, at taking you down blind alleys and giving things similar names and stuff like that to confuse you. And that's one of the greatest confusions they've created. But the law I talk about is the law, and that is recognised as the law, the paramount and mandatory law within their system, if you know where to look. Now, again, my research is divinely inspired. I could have been walking up and down, libraries, shelves of the British Library for years or whatever, or even on the internet. I could have been going for a long time without finding stuff, but I got taken to all the stuff I needed to know to show that it's a higher law recognised. Again, as you're absolutely right, John, this country is the country of the true law. That's what we've been preserving. As I say, every monarch who sits on that throne is there to preserve that law. And that's why
I certainly do. I do my part to safeguard and give it guardianship as best I can, to caretake it for the grandchildren.
No, it's something that's expressed in the culture of this country as well. I mean, there's a whole body of academic work on the law in Shakespeare, for example. And that do as you would be done by principle, which, says don't be a hypocrite and so on and things like that. it's been a very big part of our culture when you think about things like carry-on films and stuff like that. You know, as long as you don't do any harm to anybody, you can have a lot of fun. As long as it's all consenting and everything, it's all a bit of fun. The people who are satirising the carry-on films are the priggish and the hypocritical and so on, basically, and the lecturers, the ones who are just in it for the sex kind of thing. They never get their oats, basically. So there's a kind of moral of this country in things like carry-on films. I do say to any foreigners who want to come to this country, watch the carry-on films. It does give you an extraordinary insight into particularly the English and the British in general, basically. Although I do think that our culture of England, having lived in Scotland, is very different from the culture of the Scots, basically.
Well, we do have a fantastic culture of treating officialdom with absurdity, don't we?
Well, that's it. I think this is where it comes from. We've had this tradition of whether it's the Romans or the Anglo-Saxons or the Normans, we all seem to be ruled by these bloody invaders, basically.
Yeah. And bloody Romans can't take a joke.
Because we've had no systems of true rights over the government in the sense of where their political system works, we have the common law behind it. We have the spirit in which we just satirise them and take the piss out of them mercilessly. And that's why still we are the best in the world at comedy. Let's face it, we invented the modern world. The first document of constitutional government is Magna Carta, basically. The first trade unions in this country. We were the first ones to put a monarch on trial, basically. We fought modern inventions coming out of the Industrial Revolution. Where I come from, Redcar was a steel town, but it wasn't like it was just a steel town. They were doing all the new experiments with the new steels and so on to make the railways and things like that. We are an incredibly inventive island, but a lot of things we've invented, I mean, classically football, we laid down the rules for, we're absolute rubbish at. A national side performance in my lifetime, obviously I was actually alive when we won the World Cup. I'm that old, only 6 months old, mind you, but obviously I've lived in perpetual disappointment after that. And that, shows a wider malaise. But the one thing we can do is comedy. Our comedy is loved across the world. People don't quite realise in this country until you go abroad just how much our television is loved by other people as well, basically.
Well, I'm not sure about the new feminist invasion in the comedy area is going to do us any favours with that one. I'm going to probably get lynched for saying that, but I thought I'd throw that in there.
Well, that's what they do with everything, don't they? The feminists, well, just those kind of middle-class women come into everything and kill it, don't they, basically?
Well, they invent a new type of humour.
This is a really serious point, though, isn't it? Because this is how they shut up the future Bill Hicks and George Carlins, by stopping people who use comedy to challenge authority by coming through and reducing comedy to corporate banality, and that is they are trying to control the range of opinions. We're trying to control the range of what people find funny, the range of what people make jokes about. And whenever we come across, it all comes back to the same sinister agenda working away in the background, doesn't it?
Yeah, laughter is absolutely right. It's a human thing, laughter. It's the way we bond with people. We bond with people with the same sense of humour as us. I would say, when I teach spiritually, second only to love, basically, is laughter. And that one of my spiritual teachings as well is that that you're well on the way to enlightenment when you can laugh at yourself in any situation, no matter how terrible it seems or whatever. If you can just laugh at yourself in that moment,
absolutely.
It breaks a whole lot of tension, brings you back into the moment, and you're a lot better equipped to deal with it, basically. So that's why laughter is so important. And I would relate this again to the prophecy that the original mankind released himself from his archangel creators by essentially laughing at them, and the archangels had no laughter. And I think you see that archangel manifestation now amongst the serious political class and the liberals, basically, who say can't laugh. But the genuine creation of God, man, can laugh, basically. And God laughs. I mean, God loves a good pun, basically. People think that God is a severe old man and all this sort of thing. Or what I know of God is always up for a laugh, basically, because to him it's all a game.
The thing about that, though, isn't it? This liberal thing of not laughing, is behind it is fear. isn't it? It's the fear that their worldview isn't strong enough to stand against a genuine worldview expressed from a spiritual centre. I'm not saying people know that consciously, of course they don't, but energetically they certainly do. So, you come across something which is going to kick away which subconsciously know is going to kick away one of your pillars of reality. And of course you're going to want to have nothing to do with it. How dare those Kekistani meme makers mock us so awfully? We can hold up separate heads and talk about how it would be helpful if somebody would assassinate a president for us, but how dare the president share a gif of him taking down CNN at a WWF match, and that outrage, that sheer outrage, that impossibility of actually just taking a joke. It reveals a mentality that really knows it's standing on thin ice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. It does come from that whole fear thing. Obviously, these liberals are all total out-and-out atheists. So they have no divine inspiration in what they do. They have no support from God. I mean, I was an atheist, but fortunately, I was out there standing up for truth and peace and justice and things like that. So I wasn't helped by God. But these people are doing exactly the opposite. So all they're really showing is really how cut off from God they are.
Well, David, atheism is no defence against Satanism now, is it?
Well, no, I mean, but I say that actually atheism is not a rational position. I obviously thought I was very rational when I was an atheist, but it's not a rational position at all. And when you do the scientific research, you realise the parameters of creation are so narrowly defined and so many things have to happen that when you times the odds of these things happening, you're talking, 1 in 10 with 30 zeros on the end or 60 zeros on the end. So actually, if you honestly assess the scientific evidence and the laws of probability, God exists by deductive reasoning, or certainly a higher power exists by deductive reasoning. And I would argue that when you look at a sunset, when you see the immense beauty of this planet, you don't think that's going to be created by an evil God. When you see a beautiful woman, you don't think that's been created by an evil God. There's clearly a good God out there who loves us, basically. And obviously, what we've been through for 6,000 years is the Dark Age, but obviously, particularly certainly in my lifetime, we've been through the darkest hours of that, and even again in recent years, we've come through some pretty dark times. But always that silver lining has been there, and the more I see of it now, they're just not getting their own way in the same way they did before. They're key instruments of power, like the mainstream media. No one believes them anymore. I mean, you saw how the mainstream media went at Corbyn in that election. Had no effect because these young people are not reading and they're out on the internet and looking at internet memes. And again, you say the left just don't have the wit, a brevity of soul to be able to do that.
I'm nice to atheists. I talk to atheists, and I don't go around telling them they're deluded. But if I was to actually give a spiritual opinion about atheism, I would say that atheism is simply ego defense. It's a bubble around the self. It's attempting to make oneself into one's own form of God and not have to have anything to do with anything outside of that bubble. And it's all about ego. And that's why it lacks the capacity to develop true wisdom, because you have to connect to truly get into the divine consciousness and to really understand what life is and why, and to get answers to those questions and not just have this desolate void which you don't dare look at. So I'm sympathetic to atheists, and I understand why they've made the choices they have, especially those who object to having religion shoved down their throat when they were young, although I think that's less and less of them these days. But ultimately, you've got to forgive God, because it's not God's fault what man's mind fuck-up creates trying to interpret him, is it? And that explains the problems with religion. It's the mind of man getting in the way of the divine truth.
This is absolutely right. If you read the teachings of Jesus Christ in the Bible and read the teachings of the Buddha and go back to the actual teachings, as I say, you realise they're exactly the same. Now, obviously, if you look at the Buddhist church and Christian churches, you might get a very different impression. And, you have a different idea of what was going on. But that's to say, man's interpretation of the words of the divinely inspired prophets, basically.
It's the same light shining through a multitude of prisms.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, obviously, when I talk about this stuff, I mean, I do talk from a Judeo-Christian point of view mainly, because that's the culture I come from. But
likewise.
Islam has the idea of a Messiah. He's called Muhammad al-Mahdi, and that's just MD, DM, my initials, basically. They have this concept. The Hopi Indians have it. There's supposed to be a pagan culture, and you hear all these so-called New Age extolling these pagan cultures. You have to tell them that actually they do hold the concept of an end times and a chosen one of God, basically. Because we do have this almost like liberal manifestation in the New Age as well, don't we? Which is
absolutely.
Experience is a peculiarly godless spirituality, basically. And again, therefore, we know that this was created. Modern paganism in that New Age way was created about 1947 by the Lucifer Trust, that was then renamed the Lucis Trust, and was based upon the writings of people like Madame Blavatsky.
Well, David, I've never spoke to an ascended master who wasn't a wanker.
Yeah, exactly. These people are not ascended masters. They've misunderstood the prophecy if they think there's ascended masters walking the earth. And again, another good thing with spiritual teaching.
Well, it's Blavatsky philosophy, isn't it?
Of anything other than his own ego, walk away instantly, because that man is going to teach you bullshit, basically. So I'll say it again, anybody who tells you they're a master of anything other than their own ego, walk away instantly.
Okay, I do have to interject there, because we are moving towards that sort of time, and I did want to bring this up. David, obviously, through your career, you've had a lot of controversial directions you've taken that have raised all kind of people's opinions out there. I mean, I myself, I have a lot of respect for you, and I mean this respectfully. I was suspicious that perhaps Secret Services have got hold of you and done something to you to discredit you. And I mean, a lot of people had these kind of thoughts flying around, and just sort of trying to work out where it all came from. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, where are you at now with your outlook and as an individual?
Yeah, no, I'd say to anybody, my story, I've told an honest story. I've told the truth consistently.
Yeah.
People have obviously tried to malign me. I understand that, obviously, if you don't understand how the world works, some of my behaviour may look strange, but believe me, I'm doing God's work out there. Whenever I'm doing something, I've got the divine on my side. I mean, people had a go at me about being a transvestite, and that was somehow I'd gone mad, or they'd been beaming something into my head, but I've been a tranny all my life. It was just that was the point when I came out. So unless they'd been beaming my head from the age of 4 onwards, which would show a lot of prescience on their part, So, all I can say to people, anybody come and talk to me, anybody who comes and talks to me, well, I'm perfectly sane. The ideas I put forward, every single one of them is backed by concrete evidence, basically. And I say, even the existence of God, I will say, is there you can't prove a God by evidence, because it doesn't exist in this world, but you can prove it by a process of deductive reasoning that will tell you it's far more likely that this creation shows intelligent design and therefore a higher power than it doesn't. It's just a random collection of rocks and chemicals that came together and somehow created beautiful creatures with self-consciousness.
Right.
It's pretty obvious which way it's gone. And I say this is what we're seeing now is the comeback of God, and throughout the ages, it's not just in the modern age. Look at the Bible, they're saying the same things. Anybody who was a prophet was accused of being mad or self-important or whatever,
Yeah.
So this is a tradition that the other side will use to attack a genuine prophet, a genuine man of vision. I'd say if people read my research for yourself, if you have read my research, you'll understand the position I take on things. You'll understand that when I get people coming at me who don't want to speak the truth, I will insult those people. I say to them, if it's a competition of insults, I will insult you, and I can insult you far better than you can insult me. Because you're a small-minded human being, and I can brush them off, basically. So they go away very upset. So I say, that's the way I operate. I make no apology for that. The Jesus Christ of the Bible was pretty in people's face. He was prepared to go in the temple and whip the users, basically. So when people say, what would Jesus Christ do? Don't think of a doe-eyed hippie. Think of a man of action. He's quick-witted as well. When people say, why do you hang around with those evil tax collectors? He says, well, it's a sick man who needs a doctor, not a well man.
For one time, a man of peace lost his cool, wasn't it? Those darn Usurers in the temple. If I could just briefly, one last question for me, David, and I'd just like to say it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, because when I'm talking to you, I recognise common experience, having had spiritual experiences myself, which have given me great insight. It's lovely to talk to somebody on that level. But I would just like to briefly back to real world political concerns. You were recently on the Richie Allen show, and you spoke about how you felt you had a story of how Ramadan Abidi, the father of a Manchester bomber, had a code name for MI5 of Tunworth and was paid £40,000 to go after Gaddafi. We haven't got time to go into all of that now, but could you briefly just say if you're getting anywhere on people taking an interest in taking that story forwards?
Not at all, no. Just to be clear for the people listening to this, that when I blew the whistle in 1996, or say on MI6 funding Al-Qaeda in Libya, the agent was codenamed Tunworth, basically. And it now transpires this agent Tunworth is the man there. Well, he's the father of the man they're saying who carried out the Manchester bombing, Salman Abedi. They're saying it's a complicated device. So you don't have to put too much together to think, well, the expertise picked up as an MI6 agent, according to their story, could have been used by the Manchester suicide bomber to kill 22 people, many of them young girls, basically. And this is what I mean about the whole idea of getting involved in terrorism and violence. It now appears that we were secretly backing a group that were referred to as the Manchester Taliban, who could seem to pass into Britain in and out, even though they were Islamic terrorists, because they'd been sent over with MI6's connivance. This is after I blew the whistle, but we're still trying to assassinate Gaddafi, even though he was making rapprochement with the West and he wasn't a man of violence, basically. So this gives you an idea that MI6 is in fact working to a Zionist brief, because Gaddafi has always been an enemy of the Zionists, rather than to a genuine brief from the British government, which at the time, remember, Tony Blair was being very friendly to Colonel Gaddafi. And it's almost like my story has come full circle. That was why I first blew the whistle. That was the moment when I decided to leave MI5, was a moment when I was told by the MI6 officer that money had gone through to this Islamic terrorist. That was the moment in my head I thought I'm leaving this place. Obviously I had to get another job and so on, but that was the moment I thought I was going to leave. Coming around now to the 20th anniversary, 24th of August this year, 20th anniversary, suddenly we're back in there. And I say not one person will touch this. This has gone out to people like Alex Jones, it's gone out to all sorts of people, Paul Joseph Watson, but also to the Prime Minister, to the Chief of the Met, to Jeremy Corbyn. It's gone out to all sorts of other political people and so on. They won't touch it. And this just shows you the kind of world we live in. And I say it brings a wider issue about how much intelligence support there's been for Islamic terrorism, or indeed how much of it has been the entire creation of them. And that, again, dovetails into 9/11. And I say to people, I won't go into the Shayler memorandum about 9/11 will give you a much clearer idea who was behind those attacks. And I'll tell you now, there's no evidence of 19 Muslims being behind it.
Thank you very much, Dave. That's a cracking answer. I mean, just to my final response is to say that I agree with you. There's something it's all very sniffy, isn't it? And you're in a position to have seen what we haven't seen. You're in a position to know what we don't know. So I take your warning seriously. But it seems to me I'm very cautious about making any statements to allege complicity between intelligence services and terrorist attacks. However, it seems to me that at the very least, the British government is complicit with having made use of Islamic jihadis who have a UK passport. And by doing so, for their foreign policy goals in Libya and so forth, and what they've actually done is they've made themselves terribly compromised. And I'm very concerned about the possibility that the reason the British government is not acting effectively against these jihadis is in part because the jihadis have got blackmail over them.
Well, this is it. This is the whole problem. And again, it dovetails into Israel and Israel's influence over the whole computer industry. I mean, again, I had a strong suspicion about this many years ago, but the information is now coming out that Israel seems to have put a back door into just about every chip it's ever made or whatever. So again, they can know what's going on in governments and so on in a way that we can't possibly imagine. And so I say people like Israel are blackmailing governments, jihadis are blackmailing governments. So, you know, this is partly why it's the end of the age of government. We can't trust governments anymore. They've created all of this. This is all blowback for tremendously bad policies, for war crimes and so on. So this is why we're all moving away from that. We're trying to get back on the land, and that's got to be the way forward. And I haven't mentioned the coming crisis, but if you look at the graph of the national debt, it's gone exponential. Growth cannot match that. Therefore, there must be a failure of the currency at some point shorter, basically. How long we know, if whether they print more money or not. If they can't print any more money, that's when it's going to go. But I don't think we're very far away from that. So adopt the common law, stand up for your true rights, make sure the police and army know about the common law. So when the moment comes, they're on our side and not on the side of evil politicians.
Okay, well, I mean, we're going to loads of stuff now, really interesting stuff, but we have got to start wrapping it up. Is there anything, before we do, is there anything in particular you'd like to let our listeners know about, David? Any events or bits and pieces that you'd like them to check out coming up?
Not a lot at the moment. I am down to do a talk in November. That'll be going up on my site. Just mention my site, davidshayler.com, bookofthelaw.org. On Twitter, I'm at gods_spy. And my book Law is on Amazon, on the organisations on Amazon. Please buy them. That means I can live and do a bit more work.
Great. Okay, well, I mean, we covered so much subjects today. It'd be great to have you back on next time you're free to come on and sort of maybe just focus on some of the particular points we were addressing today. But that's fascinating. Really appreciate your time coming on the show, David, and we look forward to the next one.
Okay, Bruce.
It's great to talk with you.
Thank you.
Cheers, God. Good to hear from you again. Thanks very much.
Okay. God bless.
And that was David Shayler. What do you make of that one, John?
Oh, what a wild ride! You know, I mean, I can't agree with his views on all things, but he is the real deal. He has got that courage to let you abandon all common sense and do the most amazing thing to make the most amazing inner breakthrough. And I think that in that alone, he's an inspiration.
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at the flat Earth thing and I just I can't find myself going for it. But as I said at the start of the show, you got to think about these things and I think David's very good at that. He just thinks, he doesn't really care if someone says he's crazy or stupid. He'll just say what he says. He's got a lot of experience and has certainly been in some really interesting positions through his career and stuff. So yeah, you got to just take or leave what you want.
You have to go there, and you don't know where you're going, but you know that you got to go, so you go. You know, and I think a lot of the great truth speakers have spoken about that. You know, but it's the only way to push through and really force yourself to awaken as much as you can, and you know, to make growth as a person with a vision of the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you know, I've got so much respect for David Shayler on that basis.
And of course, you never know. But that is all we've got time for. I totally meant that'd be great to have David back on the show again, when we'll address some more of this stuff. It's fascinating stuff. Please keep telling your friends about the show, keep linking the show, and more importantly, keep downloading the show. And we're going to be very much looking forward to the next one. Till then, take care, be brave, be strong, and we'll be seeing you. Bye.